broadly what's More Than a Game is about and why you chose to write it now?
Well, it's about a great rivalry and a great tradition, sometimes with elements that are unacceptable and toxic, but nevertheless has gripped the imagination of millions around the world, we have to say, because of the diaspora of Scots who cling on to that tradition in the most resilient way. I go anywhere in the world, and thankfully through my broadcasting, I've been in many parts of the world, and you cannot come across more enthusiastic people about Scottish football in general, and particularly the Old Firm. When you meet them anywhere, any corner of the world I've been lucky enough to go to, you come across these people with wonderful memories. They probably have as accurate memories of things in the past than anybody else. And I think it's probably their exile that gives them that acuity more than anything else. It's like clinging on to your country by knowing the details of infinite details and minute details of particular games. And they can correct you or challenge you on various aspects, not just issues, but incidents in games and so on. And so I've always been attracted to it because I grew up in it. I came from the East End of Glasgow, and the Old Firm rivalry, everybody was steeped in the Old Firm rivalry, and it affected everything in life. And I write in a book about that particular day, the Old Firm Day, when everybody seemed to change. It became as if there was some sort of Damocles hanging over their heads, both traditions, fearing failure. I think fearing failure is one of the great characteristics of the rivalry that keeps it so intense, fear of failing. And that huge sense of relief you could experience after the game was finished. So all of these elements, including, of course, the sectarian element, that toxic side of it, which sadly makes it so special. And I think it verified, it was almost as if this game for 90 minutes was verified, was validating your beliefs, your tribe. So it was intensely tribal. I never associated it with religion, not for 1 minute. I did associate it with how you were brought up, who you associated with, how you were educated. All of these were the elements that were immensely secular, not religious. And much of it, that tribalism, is the main feature of what has kept this going for over a century and continues to do so with the same kind of passion and intensity of feeling there always has been, but different in nature. It changes in nature. From way back, it was a case of word of mouth. Communication wasn't very good amongst the working class. They had radio and newspapers, but there was no great analysis of it all, and word of mouth, and therefore the myths and the legends that accrued in association with the Old Firm grew and grew. Now we have social media. Now we have a layer of association with the fixture, like many other elements in life, politics and so on, that has given it certainly a different dimension. I think it's perpetuating in ways that don't actually parallel what is happening on the ground, if I could put it that way. In other words, there's been a great deal of improvement over the years in the relationship between the two sets of supporters. I mean, there's intense dislike from for one another.
Yeah.
But logistically, it seems so much better in seated stadiums. I know this is simply a physical thing, nothing to do with the ideas that germinate between these two factions. But it's worked to a great extent. Stadiums can be easily policed and culprits identified much more easily. And supporters associations are better self-behaved. I mean, they realize the difficulty you can get into if you have problems in your own stadium, or perhaps if your colours are identified with a particular incident. So there's a kind of spontaneous self-regulation. I hope that's not a contradiction in terms amongst supporters groups. So there has been improvement. But then you feel this acrid atmosphere that still exists, much of it coming from social media, and also intensified at this moment in time because of this pursuit of 10 in a row, which has given it a new identity and a new edge. So I wanted to write about this, and of course, in previous books, I've touched on old firm rivalries, but this one I wanted to specify on the one game, pardon me, the infamous riot that took place in 1980, May 10, 1980 at Hampden
Which, of course,
Park.
makes up the cover of the book.
Oh, yeah.
Incredible photography. Lovely cover, actually. Very
Yes, actually,
evocative.
Lewis, the publisher, have done a very good job with that. There's a story in itself and how it was eventually published, but that's another issue altogether.
That's next year.
But yeah, so I wanted to base it on that and then expand, radiate from one particular game with a notorious reputation into some of the issues and the roots and the personalities, all mixed together. And I started off with that idea, not knowing if I could get the right kind of material or finish it and so on. But many of the books I've started, I'm not sure whether I would have finished or not, but this particularly so. But so I wanted the contrast between the physical side of it, that is, what happened that day? Who was responsible for it? Who was involved? Quite apart from the motivation for the conflict that eventually happened on the pitch. So I contrasted the details, the minutiae, if you like, of that day with the broad areas of sectarianism that pervaded the whole atmosphere and always has done. So there was that contrast. And then the personal stories of people who were affected one way or the other are contrasted between a heroine of the day with one of the major casualties of the day and how it affected their lives in different ways. That's a story in itself within the book. But underpinning everything else was the hatreds, the conflicts, and the ancient rivalries. That underpins, well, hopefully in the book, it underpins everything else.
How did you find that process of recalling it all? Were you looking back at newspapers, speaking to people, or is it all just in there for you still?
Well, the day was always within me. The visuals of the day were always within me, although I had to do some refreshing, but I can even remember some of the words I used in commentary, etc., etc. But yes, examining newspapers, I was helped incredibly by Dave Scott of Nil by Mouth, who provided me with his files on the subject of sectarianism. And as you know, Nil by Mouth is the anti-sectarianism organization, which was set up way back. And his files were invaluable. I could not have written the book without these files. There's no question at all about that. And then I did my own general investigation of other things, but particularly interviews. This is what worried me about tracking down people. I was helped by the Glasgow Police Museum. I went to see them. They were very helpful, and they gave me contact numbers. They didn't know if people were still alive, so it was a bit of a gamble. So I phoned around and eventually did get people who played. I think it was just a coincidence. It wasn't because of my sophisticated historical research. Just coincidence that I came across people who carried on significant roles that day, that afternoon. And so I arranged them through the book. And the style of the book was a bit like, you might remember a book called The Bridge of San Luis Rey, which was written years ago about the collapse of a bridge. I'm not sure, I think it was Thornton Wilder, I'm not sure who the author was. The principle of the book, like Rashomon the film, is to take an incident and have other people interpret that incident for you. In other words, they could look back and tell me what they saw of the incident, and you build up this, if you like, pattern, this kaleidoscopic pattern with different voices saying different things about the event. That was my idea in it anyway. So the narrative cuts between that day and other incidents involving the old firm. Some of the conflicts, the political conflicts off the field, as well as what happened on the field, dating back to the 1940s, when I talk about the infamous riot at Ibrox Park, when two prominent players at the time, Sammy Cox and of Rangers, Charlie Tully of Celtic, were involved in a fracas down near the Celtic end. And the Celtic supporters thought that the referee should have sent off Sammy Cox and so on. And there was a riot, bottle throwing, and so on. And it was because of the aftermath of that led me to rethink my attitude to this fixture altogether. Because as a boy, I remember a youth, I was in my teens, I watched a fight on a bus, which was several days after the Cox-Tully incident, because it had been reported in the press and discussed in the press, the controversy of that, whether Cox did actually kick him and whether he should have been sent off or not. And there were men fighting in a bus going to the dogs, and I don't mean that metaphorically, physically going to the dogs at Cantown. And that was astonishing, because everything else had been somewhat in the abstract. The sectarianism, that sort. It had just been one of these things you debated about and never actually touched you. Well, it did touch me that day. And that changed. And I pursued that through the years. I was fascinated by that. And I tried to talk. Eventually, when I got a position where I was able to do it with the BBC, I decided to pursue it and try to make a broadcast of it. And also interested in writing a book even at that time, although at that time I didn't get around to doing it. But I did pursue it. Charlie Tully obviously had died, sadly, before that time. But I did get hold of Sammy Cox in Canada and spoke to him. He didn't look changed from the day he played. That day, he was remarkable. He lived until he was into his 90s, for that matter. And so I built that story as a kernel and a route finder, if you like, through the rest of the book. And so that's how I went about that. Logistically, that's how I went and sat down at my computer to eventually write it.
One of the reasons we're talking for Book Week Scotland today is this Us and Them, a book on football rivalry I helped Nil by Mouth produce, which we'll come back to at the end. Dave Scott writes the chapter on the old firm in that book, but chose to concentrate on more positive elements, on stories of friendship between Celtic and Rangers fans, and that
I know, I've read that.
Yes. Angle of things. So what can this rivalry, what can this fixture be at its best?
Well, at its best, an exciting football match that can take our minds away from what many of the supporters think the game is all about. It's a football match. And of course, it's more than a football match. I mean, I go back to the Bill Shankly misquote about football is much more serious than life and death, etc. It's much more that to a lot of people, hence the almost fanatical pursuit of 10 in a row. At its best, simply, I mean, I separate the two things. There is never going to be, I think, in a Celtic Rangers match, an improvement on human relations, particularly in the west of Scotland. I don't think it's going to fortify us in a belief in the brotherhood of man. I don't think it's ever going to do that. But if we can simply take our minds away from it and extol the virtues of the game itself and of the great heroes in the game, I think that is beneficial. Of course, Dave is right to play up the friendships that existed amongst the different people of different colours. That is entirely true. And I know them, and I know people who goes to games together but separate. Well, in a sense, they separate for logistical reasons, as many supporters now do around the world. But I emphasise in the book that it really was only in Glasgow that, as I grew up as a boy, that you had that segregation, that people were so separate they wouldn't go in the turnstiles together. And I talk about the village of Glenboig in one of the chapters where they wouldn't go in the same door of the pub, of the village pub. There were separate doors for the village pub, and it was a benign pub. There was never, in all the recollection I taught in the village, and in the history of that pub, there was never any fights or aggravation. And that made it worse for me, because it was so benign. Mm. Why were they going in separate doors? Nobody was questioning this. It was rooted. It was solid. There were many friends in that village. Obviously, you live close together in a village. Glenboig has now expanded into almost a suburb of Glasgow, but then when I was there, it was definitively a village. And I write about that in the book, that it puzzled me that there was no two buses went to Hampden that day, Rangers and Celtic. They came back into that same pub, went through their separate doors. There was no trouble. One side depressed, other side jubilant. And it was a separate door issue. And of course, I expanded into the separate schools about the division, the acceptance and the acquiescence of division in society, traditionally, historically. And yes, friendship is all to the good, and it should be highlighted, as Dave does in his chapter in the book. But it's difficult to see advancing the fraternal feelings after a Celtic Rangers match. The vast majority come away clinging to the belief they're actually superior to the other kind, or that the referee was against them. It ranges in that way, in that dimension.
Do you miss commentating on those games?
Yes, and it came to mind most vividly for me when I went to Paris. I left the BBC and went freelance. I was working for the BBC in London and doing very well down there, introducing different programs. I was introducing particularly Breakfast Time, along with different people, Jeremy Paxman, Frank Boff, people like that. I was getting on very well, but I had one or two disputes with BBC Scotland And I decided to leave of my own volition, I have to add. And I went to Paris and worked with Eurosport there. And it was there in Paris I really missed it.
Mm.
There's a great French sports newspaper, which you'll know only too well, Daniel, L'Equipe.
Mm.
On Old Firm Day, that was the only time they mentioned Scottish football. And it was only about 10 pars, only a small paragraph. And one, I missed it, and two, it lent me a new perspective because Europe wasn't really paying much attention to that so-called great Old Firm global rivalry. And I did miss the tension. I mean, I was ultimately commentating on European Cups, European Cup finals, etc., etc. But it didn't carry with them. It didn't. I wasn't invested with that same tension that came along with the Old Firm game. So yes, I definitely missed it.
In both your book, More Than a Game, As You Would Expect, and the Nil by Mouth book, Us and Them, a horrendous incident, which will be 50 years ago, just after New Year, the Ibrox disaster, is featured. Yes. Dave speaks with a man who was there as a boy, and you were, of course, there. So does that day still haunt you?
Yes. I may say, just for the record, to be accurate, I got there after the game had finished. I was presenting the program in the studio, or was about to pretend to present the program in the studio on that particular afternoon. Very cold, dank, misty afternoon, as I can recollect. And George Davidson, the man I replaced the commentator, was commentating on the actual game itself. And it was an incredible day because I was in the studio preparing, in the office preparing my script for the studio. And we would go on the air at 5 o'clock, break away from BBC Network Grandstand and do a 15-minute Scottish insert. And I was getting prepared for that. And we were hearing the game coming in on radio. And to cut a story short, Rangers equalised in the last seconds of the game. And there was a bit of turmoil as we began to change our reports because of the last minute change in the game. And then we heard Frank Boff saying almost casually, we hear there's been 2 deaths at Ibrox Park. And we pricked up our ears, understandably, but then got on with what we were doing. I can't remember how long it was after that, maybe 6 or 7 minutes. And he's doing his various things, reports from games coming in all over the place. And he suddenly said, I'm sorry, a correction on that last one. We hear that 22 have died, have been killed at Ibrox. Now, that stopped us in our tracks completely. And I wondered if he got it wrong, but almost immediately he verified this was the report coming in. My first reaction was there had been a Donnybrook, that there had been a major fight, either in the stadium itself or just outside in the vicinity of the stadium. That was my very first reaction. So we wanted to find out more about this, and we didn't know any more about it. And the curious thing is, there were radio broadcasters there. There was a full television outside broadcast unit there. And they all packed up and went home without knowing of a single death in the stadium that day. And as you know, 66 died. It's because of the remoteness of what happened. The incident happened on the stairs leading out of the stadium, down the stairs before they got to the exit. And our cameras and our radio were, if you like, hundreds of yards away from that. And they actually packed up with our outside broadcast unit, drove off to East Kilbride, the depot, and it was only there they had the news that a huge number of people had died. I got there as Jock Stein, the Celtic manager, was coming out of the door of Ibrox. Somebody asked him what he thought of the game. And he went through this guy, because Stein himself had helped some of the bodies be placed in the indoor track at Ibrox. And I just waltzed right in because they knew me, and I saw the dead bodies, and it had an incredible effect on me. I had a football match, seeing this at a football match or after a football match. So that was an incredible day that has lived with me ever since. And there was a period of grace after that, where I remember Rangers supporters in the cathedral coming up to get Jock Stein's autograph and so on. It's a mundane thing that was happening on the back of a tragedy, and there was various cross-fertilization of sympathy from the two sets of supporters. But it died. It simply frittered away, because in a charity game where there was a mix of Old Firm players playing in this charity game at Ibrox, several of the players were being booed by Rangers supporters because they were Celtic, and so on. And within a year, we were back to where we were, which has made me always very suspicious of the rate and the intensity of recovery from any particular conflict, like the one I was writing about, the 1980 version of it, the conflict then.
So it was a missed opportunity for more unity, really, for longer unity.
Yes, you see, the major trouble is that nobody would intervene in this. There was we got pious utterances from various clerics from the pulpit about it all. But the only interference that would matter would be political interference. There wasn't a will. And part of the diminution of that will was the fact that many were Old Firm supporters. They had this feeling of, for example, we've noted how the churches have been very reluctant to expose themselves to scandal in various ways. Well, in terms of politics, there are many people just didn't want to dip their fingers into this at all. Too toxic politically. So they make many pious utterances about it, but it really didn't have any effect.
Another seminal moment in this rivalry, a dark, bleak moment in this rivalry, was the 1995 murder of Mark Scott. What do you remember of that, and what was the consequence, or what were the consequences of it?
Well, sadly, my first reaction was simply, it's a newspaper headline about Rangers and Celtic again. A tragedy, yes, but what would one expect? You're going to get, sadly, you're going to get an extreme act like that. That was my first kind of reaction. And then as it developed, that was a kind of knee-jerk reaction. And then as it kind of developed and people started to write about it, we all did a rethink, and I had to write about it myself. And I wrote for the Herald at that time. I had a column for the Herald. And I remember I always read it thoroughly. I saw this letter that had come in from a Cara Henderson from Oxford University, from one of the halls at Oxford. And it was a long letter. I remember it was 2 columns long, very prominent, in which she castigated a certain Rangers director for singing sectarian songs, and went on to the wider subject of sectarianism, violence, and her friend Mark Scott, whom she had gone to school with, had been murdered and the effect it had on her and so on. So she became more prominent. And then I saw her outside Ibrox Park, surrounded by photographers, because Rangers had invited her to go to a game, sit in the director's box, welcomed her with open arms and said, look, this was awful what happened. Come with us, we'll see if we can talk with you and so on. But all she got from that was the atmosphere of an Old Firm game and the hatred that floated up towards her ears. But in seeing her there, she was not an insubstantial figure, but in the melee outside Ibrox Park that day before the game, she looked dwarfed. Not even physically dwarfed, but dwarfed by the enterprise that she was, or the object of the enterprise that she was about to go against. So I went back home and I wrote a column called it Eyes Wide Shut. I called it that because it was based on the title of a film that had been made by Stanley Kubrick, which had nothing to do with football or anything like that, but the title appealed to me because I felt she's going nowhere. She's going to get how could a wee girl? And really, I'm being honest about this. This is my reaction. How could a wee girl like that take on this behemoth, this huge institution, not just Ibrox, but Celtic and Rangers, and all the violence and hatred that comes from them? How could she possibly take that on? And my article was really about the diminutive approach to this could never succeed. Well, she wrote back. She wrote another letter taking me on, saying she understood what I was talking about, but nevertheless, everybody had to have the courage of the convictions, and she would keep going on. And of course she did. Hence Nil by Mouth, hence this organization which has splendidly fought against all forms of sectarianism. And I conceded that to her in the book. I conceded my dismissal of her as quite wrong. And I think she accepted it. When she's talked to me at length on the phone about it, turns out to be not only a crusader, but a crusader against sectarianism, but a crusader full stop. She has issues and objectives that she's pursuing right now. She had, it's an interesting thing, she had, James Macmillan had written a piece dedicated to her, which was played at the proms in London. James is a very religious person. Well, in actual fact, he was dedicating it to an atheist because she had given up her belief at some stage and made that clear in a lecture, which I partly quote to a Swiss university. So it's all very interesting, all these the clashes of personality that were dragged into this.
What about bringing it to now, Archie? Do you think the absence of fans at several Old Firm fixtures will change the atmosphere in any way when fans do return to Ibrox and Parkhead?
I doubt that very much. I think they'll resort to the familiar environment. I can't see it changing very much. In fact, they'll be champing at the bit right now to get at each other, verbally, of course. I mean, that's a fact. They'll just do that. That's the nature of the beast. I don't think it'll change all that much. But let me insist, things are much, much better. Much, much better than they used to be. as I say, there's a physical side to it that's controllable. But I talk to people who are much closer to the game now than I am, like commentators who work weekly and so on and travel around the country. Andy Walker, he won't mind me quoting him, he says it's worse than it's ever been. These feelings that exist between them. So that sounds terribly depressing, but I balance it against a quality of change that is taking place. Certainly far from eradicating, but it is. I see it softening, maybe too easy a word to use, but it's essentially different from what it was, certainly from when I was a boy.
So moving, as we head towards the end, to this nature, the nature of rivalries more broadly. We did the book Us and Them. Several writers chose their own rivalries to write about. So we have one on a new rivalry, possibly between China and India. We have one on rivalries in the Balkans, a best player rivalry between Pele and Messi, rivalries in the Basque country, financial rivals, and I wrote myself about Guernsey and Jersey, which is an interesting old rivalry. So that general question, Archie, if you could go to any fixture between rivals or fixtures in the world, which would you go to?
Well, I don't know whether you've been in Argentina or not. I've been in it twice. I was there in 1977, and I was there in a pre-World Cup tour. I was there in 1978. I have never, in all the travels, and that's including traveling to Ibrox and Parkhead, I have never come across fanaticism quite as I experienced in Argentina. Now, it was coming at us a time when nationalism in Argentina, populism, if you like, had produced General Videla, who had introduced the totalitarian state. I mean, we used to go into a stadium in Argentina and were men lined up against the wall with their hands up in the airs. And these were the groundsmen being checked out by the police with guns and so on. When I did a commentary in the Boca Juniors Stadium, Scotland against Argentina, the game was delayed because we, in the broadcasters, had found a suspicious package and so on. So it was behind a commentary position. So it was a very volatile country. And when Alan Heron, the Sunday Mail writer, and I went to a restaurant on the night that Argentina beat Peru 6-0 to get them into, I think, the semi-final or something like that, or the quarterfinal. In this restaurant, they were standing on the tables, grown men, middle-aged men, Argentina, Argentina, chanting. Now, if you take the stadia there, the Boca Juniors Stadium is precipitous. I suffer from heights, from a fear of heights. And you look down on it and you feel you're going to fall over and so on. Pike that for the River Plate Boca Juniors derby, which had to be, on one occasion, sent to Spain, to Madrid, to be played in the Bernabeu, to prevent any more trouble. I would love to be in the middle of that, to see a Boca Juniors River Plate game. I think that would have been, it would have made Rangers and Celtic make them seem a little bit tedious. But the best, the most fascinating local derby was one that you kind of write about in your book, about islands. About Guernsey and Jersey, one of your writers, Guernsey and Jersey. And
That's
so
me,
on.
yeah.
You did, yes. It was you yourself. You can't beat me. I can better that.
Oh, yes.
I went to the Scilly Isles.
Oh, that is a
And we
dream.
filmed a story there of a league competition, a League Cup competition, and a cup competition, the Scilly Isles Cup, played by the same teams over and over again every Saturday. And the guy giving the team selection to us when we were filming it said, we can't get our goalkeeper. He's on light keeper duty, lighthouse keeper duty.
Oh.
So there's another guy in the team said, I'll prove it to you. Come in my airplane. So they took us up in an airplane and flew us round the lighthouse with a guy waving at us. The goalie couldn't play that day. So they played the same players, the same faces, the same individuals, week after week in the different cup competitions. That is the ultimate local derby.
Do you think rivalries can be a healthy thing?
Yes, I do. Of course it is, because it can get you to exceed what you think you yourself can do. It can bring out the best in you. There's no doubt that through the years of going back to the old film, there was more intensity in that game. You talk to Rangers and Celtic players, it was special for them. It was special for them the week before the actual game was played. So there was that kind of rivalry. I have to say, it didn't match the toxic nature of what would happen in the streets and the terracings, because by and large, Rangers and Celtic players got on very well. They really did. Of course, there was some trouble in games, but then there's trouble in other games as well. Mm. And yes, it does. It gives you an appreciation of what you can do because of what you see in front of you, something you've nurtured feelings about for a long time. Mm. It can do. I've been thinking about writing a book about our relationship with the English and with English football, based on the breaking of the bar at Wembley, which you might recall in the pitch. Because there was something always special about taking on the English. Mm. Definitely always. It produced a feeling of apprehension in me that was difficult to describe. Mm. Scotland, England. Very, very different. And that's why the Scottish players, when they succeeded, really felt they had done some justice to themselves. Like the Baxter keep you up at Wembley.
It would be interesting to look at that from the other point of view, because there's something of a perception that it doesn't matter quite as much to England as it does to Scotland. Do you think that's a fair reflection of the rivalry?
I think it is. Yes, it is very special. I think it's special to the Welsh when they play the English, to the Irish when they play the English, that we feel we have to prove ourselves, our virility as underdogs in terms of population and so on. But on the other hand, I remember Kevin Keegan telling me that when he was going out to play at Wembley against Scotland on one occasion, where it was difficult to spot an Englishman in the crowd. Close to 85,000, I think there might have only been 1,500 English in the stadium at that time. In those days, changed days, of course. And a Scottish supporter spat on him, going up out of the walkway at Wembley onto the pitch, leant over and spat on him. And that inspired the English players that day. The fact that they were outnumbered in the stadium, that singular act, obscene act, and they went on to win 3-0, I think, or 3-1 that particular occasion. And that brought it out of them. Yes, the English do not regard it with the same intensity as we do.
Well, this Englishman is going to be careful and ask you instead. That's a hint at a fascinating topic. I'd love to read that. Any other writing and book plans in the next couple of years?
Maybe. I always start off with a gem of an idea. I've killed many gems of ideas myself over the years, and they've never reached any conclusion. I did on one occasion try a novel, but I kind of disowned it. I didn't like it after it was finished. It fell between a young adult and what I considered would have been a novel, a mystery novel, if you like. I didn't kind of disowned it. So I got my fingers burned on that, and I wouldn't attempt that again.
But plenty of ideas there, and plenty more words to come. More Than a Game is available now. Really different insight, in-depth insight. I enjoyed it tremendously. As you know, Archie, I'm an immigrant in this country, and it was an education and a fascinating, at times saddening and maddening education to me. Ditto Us and Them you can get on the Nil by Mouth website. The proceeds of this book go towards keeping the Nil by Mouth education programme going in schools, and I think it's fair to say that has to be the future for...
Sure, let me recommend that book, because it's a variations on a theme. And I think that's good, the contrast. I mean, China against India, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
Most populous countries in the world, with Marcelo Lippi as a coach. So I don't know whether he still is the coach.
I think he's left by now, hasn't he? I looked that up recently as well. But yeah, that is a fixture to watch, isn't it? As we go on in our Western world kind of way, you suspect things are happening in the Far Eastern places. For my own part, I've brought up 2 books this year. Snapshot, which is an offshoot of Nutmeg magazine, of which I'm editor, which is a travel book around various parts and places and homes of football in Scotland, with the photography of Alan McCready and my own words. And Extra Time, which is the follow-up to a book named Saturday 3 p.m, which me and Archie once discussed on Off the Ball, I believe. So 50 further delights of modern football. Yeah. So plenty for people's Christmas stockings, Archie. It's a really good time for football books.
Can I you don't mind me just mentioning one other thing? I've done the audiobook of Jock Stein, which I did during lockdown for something to do, and that's available on Amazon. This is shameful.
It's not shameful at all, actually. To have the author of a book and his voice and a voice like yours read the words is a special thing. So I'm glad. I'm not glad of lockdown, and I'm not glad of anything to do with this year, but at least something came from it for you. And I wrote a couple of books as well. So there we are.
Good.
Thanks very much, Archie.
Not at all.